Good morning. My name is Adrienne Liu, and I'm a researcher with the Pew Charitable Trust. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization working to improve public policy in a broad range of areas. Thank you very much to the Hutchins Center for inviting us to speak. And today I'm excited to share with you some highlights from our research looking at how states detect fiscal distress in local governments. And my co-authors, Matt Cook, Danny Newman, and Steve Fehr are also here with us today. So I'd like to begin by asking a question. Can I have a show of hands of everyone who comes from a state that regularly collects information from local governments and uses it to assess their fiscal condition? And now can I have a show of hands of everyone who comes from a state that does not regularly monitor their local governments in this way? Collects and uses with the first one. Second was does not collect and use it. And finally, can I have a show of hands of everyone who thinks it sounds like a good idea, but have no idea what their state actually does? Intuitively, it might seem like states should be interested in keeping tabs on how their local governments are doing from a fiscal perspective. We know that credit rating agencies, for example, argue that states can help to bolster their local governments without hurting their own financial health. And from East Cleveland, Ohio to Opelika, Florida, from Atlantic City to Detroit, we've seen time and again how states can become involved in local fiscal crises. For states, that can mean unanticipated expenditures and political headaches, among other problems. We also know that across the country, many local governments are facing difficult financial challenges, such as growing liabilities for pension and retiree health benefits and deferred infrastructure costs. In many cases, these expenses continue to grow even as state and federal aid to local governments remains depressed compared to where it was before the recession. These constrained local budgets have had a very real human impact on public services, from social services to education to public safety. But fiscal distress can look very different in different places. In Michigan, for example, officials felt forced to choose between maintaining public safety and infrastructure to disastrous results in Flint. In Oregon, police departments that can't afford 24-hour coverage have placed mannequins in police cars parked alongside roads to give the appearance of patrols. In 2013, Pew conducted a 50-state survey looking at how and when states intervene in local government fiscal crises. We define intervention as when states take over decision-making authority from local governments. We examined which states have laws defining local fiscal distress, which states allow local governments to file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, and whether and how states actually intervene. Among the recommendations that came out of that report was for states to take a more proactive approach to detecting fiscal distress in their local governments. And the idea was that by detecting distress earlier, states could help local governments from ever reaching the crisis stage. So this time around, we were interested in taking a step back to understand better what states do before they reach the intervention stage. We knew that some states had either created new fiscal monitoring systems or expanded existing ones in recent years, including New York, Nevada, and Rhode Island. But we wanted to take a comprehensive look to understand which states monitor their local governments and how exactly they do that. So we wanted to ask questions like how often states check in with their municipalities, what types of documents they rely on for data, what indicators they look at, whether fiscal monitoring activities are required by state law, and what they actually do when they find distress or signs that it may be on the horizon. We'll be publishing our full report later on this summer, but today I'll highlight for you some of our key findings. So what is fiscal monitoring? As you may know, there's no standard definition for fiscal monitoring, but we were interested in looking at states that actively and regularly review financial information from their local governments and use it to either specifically try to detect local distress or more generally just to assess their financial condition. And by states that actively review financial information, we were looking for states that are proactively collecting and analyzing this information instead of just sitting back to wait to see what pops up on their radar. For this study, we looked at states that monitor local purpose general governments from the county level below, so that includes counties, cities, towns, and villages. We excluded school districts, which are typically handled very differently by states, as well as special purpose districts like fire districts. We examined state statutes and administrative code and looked at state government websites, and then we followed up by interviewing officials in every state. And then to understand how local governments feel about how their states approach this issue, we reached out to municipal leagues in every state as well. It's important to note here that we did not attempt to evaluate how effective these various systems are. One reason for this is that there is so much variation among the states in terms of how they interact with their local governments, how they define fiscal distress, and what they do when they find fiscal distress, that it would be very difficult to evaluate these different types of systems using a common measure. But we did find some promising approaches which apply broadly, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So now I'll talk about 3 key findings from our research. We found that 22 states meet our basic criteria for fiscal monitoring, and these are the dark blue states on the map. I want to emphasize here that we deliberately cast a wide net so that this group of 22 states includes some states where fiscal monitoring is not required by state statute, where it may only apply to counties or the largest cities. In some cases, it takes place only once every 2 or 3 years, so pretty infrequently. So the 22 states range from those with fairly minimal levels of monitoring to those with fairly robust and established systems, but we wanted to capture the range of activities being undertaken by states. Of the 22 states that do fiscal monitoring, we classify 7 as early warning states. And these are states that both, 1, have a law defining local fiscal distress, and 2, have a system designed to identify signs that a locality may be headed toward fiscal distress. So, for example, if a state defines fiscal distress as a local government defaulting on a debt payment, we asked, does the state have a system designed to flag indicators that might precede a missed debt payment? Third, we found that states have very different approaches and attitudes toward fiscal monitoring. For example, fiscal monitoring is handled by departments of Revenue, Treasury, Finance, Controller, Auditor's Office, Economic Development, in some cases by units dedicated specifically to local government services. States also rely on a variety of different methods and indicators to detect distress using budgets, audits, and other financial statements. And we also found that attitudes toward fiscal monitoring vary greatly. In some states, officials told us that it's become accepted as part of a state's historic responsibilities. And in other states, officials said that because they didn't feel they had the authority to intervene in the case of fiscal crisis, they didn't see any point in trying to detect distress. Now I'm going to move from our research finding to the promising approaches that I mentioned. Based on our research, we identified 4 key principles that states should adhere to when designing monitoring systems. So first, formal systems and processes that spell out how fiscal monitoring should work help to promote transparency, predictability, and consistency. For example, establishing specific indicators helps to ensure that monitoring takes place consistently from one year to the next and through changes in personnel. And codifying monitoring state statute helps to strengthen a state's commitment to both detecting fiscal distress and to helping local governments when distress is found, even through times of tight state budgets and through administration changes. So Rhode Island, for example, which strengthened its fiscal monitoring system in the aftermath of the Central Falls bankruptcy, learns about local fiscal distress through a variety of means, all of which are codified in state law. For example, municipalities must present proposed tax rates and budgets to the state before they are advertised. They are required to file quarterly budget reports, and they're required to file 5-year forecasts, including pensions and other post-employment benefit costs. Second, detecting distress early can help local governments to address their fiscal problems before they become unmanageable. Many monitoring states assess financial information only on an annual basis, and they're often looking at the previous year's data, which makes it very difficult to predict distress. Only 7 states meet our criteria for early warning states, and once again, those are 1, having a law defining fiscal distress, local fiscal distress, and 2, having a system designed to identify signs that a locality may be headed in that direction. So Nevada, for example, which examines local government audits, budgets, and other statements, looks for 27 distinct indicators of distress. They also approve proposed local tax rates, which is another opportunity for the state to learn of worrisome trends. A handful of other states do have robust fiscal monitoring systems that try to predict distress, but do not have laws defining distress. And those laws are important because they help local governments to know how they will be assessed, and they help to provide consistency over time. Third, good working relationships between state and local governments are critical. Although state oversight over local governments can naturally lead to a certain amount of tension, some states have succeeded in working in a cooperative manner with local governments so that local governments view states as their partners and not just enforcers. Fiscal monitoring systems that are well designed and well executed can serve as a regular mechanism of communication between state and local governments. And some states have helped to ensure cooperation between state and local officials by giving local officials a formal role in the monitoring process. For example, Connecticut has a Municipal Finance Advisory Commission. This is an 8-member advisory group that offers advice to cities that are struggling financially to help them try to avoid state intervention. And by law, half the members of that commission must come from municipalities. And finally, states should undertake fiscal monitoring with the goal of avoiding state intervention if at all possible. This is because state intervention is costly, it's typically not welcomed by local residents or officials, and it's incredibly difficult to execute well. Instead, states should focus on helping local governments to get back on their feet in the short run and to achieve fiscal sustainability in the long run. States should develop a range of tools to help local governments, ranging from those showing the earliest warning signs of distress to those already in mid-crisis. Among the options that are offered by states are technical assistance, working with them on budgets, and providing training. Last year, for example, in response to the unfolding fiscal crisis in North Las Vegas, Nevada created the designation of Fiscal Watch, which allows the state to work informally with local governments to help them solve their own financial problems. And the goal is to try to avoid ever reaching the severe financial emergency status where the state can appoint a temporary manager to take over day-to-day operations in a city. In conclusion, states take a broad variety of approaches to detecting local distress. Although fiscal monitoring systems must vary according to the individual needs, goals, and context of each state, our research revealed a number of promising approaches that apply broadly. While some local fiscal crises are truly unpredictable, states can play a critical role in ensuring that local governments remain as fiscally healthy as possible, and that when signs of distress do emerge, that states learn about it sooner rather than later. As state and local governments prepare for the next economic downturn, some may want to consider adopting fiscal monitoring systems or strengthening existing ones. For states, the smart question to ask is not if another local government will face a fiscal crisis, but when and where. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
As we complete our trifecta discussants, I think we were brainstorming and say, well, who should be the discussant? I say, hey, let's see if we get Gail here. All of a sudden, she's here. So I can think of no better person, just because, and I've been trying to look professional and patiently sit up there for 2 hours. I think I've earned a question. I got a question of discussing, and I think it's fascinating. There's no one in this room who would say, should we have fiscal monitors? You know, we did the show of hands here. Of course, hey, that seems like a great idea. Let's have fiscal monitors. Who knows what the cost is? Right. But the highest level of respect for your profession, what you do, your position in the industry, and you have a whole building doing it. Can you really be a leading indicator if you're a fiscal monitor, or is it the point where you say, hey, the house is burning, you better call the fire department? So that's just my one question, if there's time within your 10 minutes. So thank you.
Boy, that's quite a lead-in. Kind of nerve-wracking. So maybe I could start for a moment, and for those of you who don't know me or don't know what I do and what my other colleagues at rating agencies do, we are independent observers of activity in the market, and we assess the likelihood that an issuer is going to repay their debt in full and on time. But I believe none of us who do what I do are in a position to endorse a position one way or the other. So we're really observers. So if I sound more like, this is what we see, as opposed to this is what you should do, that's really the reason. So as I just want to make a couple of comments. One is I'm quite grateful that I was asked to speak on Adrienne's piece because it was so readable. I don't know how well I would have done with all those statistical analyses. And my initial reaction was that I very much am aligned, we're very much aligned with a lot of the conclusions that she came to. So I had a bunch of prepared remarks, but I can't help but go back to some of the points that were made earlier today in the discussion about Chapter 9 and bankruptcy. So I just want to link all of that together. One is that intervention, state oversight and intervention, in our view, is actually provides stronger credit quality to a local government than the ability to just file. There's a lot of discussion about the value of filing and whether that's good or bad, but the reality is that oversight and intervention, if it's done in advance, it doesn't eliminate that risk, but it certainly helps to mitigate that risk. So in the same spirit, Adrienne was talking about a 2013 report. We also, around the same time, did a similar assessment of the impact of state, we call it oversight, on local governments. The only real difference is we covered school districts as well, and specifically because we know how much more oversight there often is for school districts from the state levels. So we had a few key themes. One is that strong oversight of local governments by the parent state is generally a credit positive. Like I said, it doesn't prevent a default, but it can very well be a credit positive. So they don't necessarily avoid default. We have Pontiac School District, the city of Detroit, so there's a couple of really good examples right there. Strong oversight and monitoring also doesn't detract from the state's credit quality, and Adrienne mentioned that point. When I talk about oversight and intervention, it's not transfer of funds from a state to a local government. It's very often in the context of guidance. It could be control boards. It could be the ability to bring in experts who can kind of sort out what is the root of the problem. Is the problem economic? Is the problem prioritization? Is the problem pensions? Is it education? What's the nature of the problem? And try to address the issues based on what you see the problem is. Another point, which I also agree, is that the level of intervention and oversight varies very widely. If you go back to the chart, the map that Adrienne showed before, we've anecdotally really talked about clusters of places in the U.S. where there's a concentration of areas of oversight, and hadn't really thought about it, but there is a lot going on in the Northeast and along the Atlantic coast. But there are other states, as you've mentioned, like Alabama and California, who don't necessarily take assertive actions on that, yet California does on the school district side. So it's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that we noticed is that 3 times as many states have strong oversight of school districts compared to the other group of local governments, counties, cities, states, villages, and things like that. So one of the things that I think about is monitoring the activity of reviewing all that information. Is monitoring the same as oversight? Because you could monitor, but if you don't have a framework to create some oversight and action, you may not be able to do anything about what you see. I think that's an important element as well. So just from our perspective as credit analysts, we do give credit positive view for governments that are in that environment where there's demonstrated support. Whether or not, if it's in statute, if it's in legislation, that's fine, but it's also how you use it and where you use it, and has it been historically used, which is something that we take into consideration. So just a quick example is Atlantic City and the state of New Jersey. So we have always considered the oversight function by the state of New Jersey for their distressed cities to be relatively strong. We felt that they had historically supported them, and there are distressed city programs. What we're watching unfold in Atlantic City really begins to undermine our view of the level of support that the state of New Jersey will actually provide to their local governments. And in the paper that Adrienne wrote, she commented that we had published something that said that if Atlantic City actually does default, it will likely bring into question our view of the level of oversight and support, not monetary support, but structural support, that the state of New Jersey may actually be able to provide to the other distressed cities that are under their umbrella fiscal distress programs. It's not a contagion issue. It's just an issue that they have historically provided a level of support. They have these oversight programs, but if they let that city go, what does that really mean for the others? And that's just something that we're going to need to be looking at. Well, just one other point that I want to mention on that is that we do understand as a practitioner, as a rating analyst, a credit analyst, is that there may be a difference between what an oversight board does to ensure that that the local government continues to provide the essential services that they need to provide. That obviously is paramount. But our role as credit analysts are looking at the piece of their situation that relates to paying back the funds that they borrowed for specific purposes. So sometimes those two things can come into conflict, right? And I know that as a citizen, you want to be sure that essential services are provided. As a bondholder, you want to be sure you get paid back. So there's a lot of conversation earlier this morning about those prioritizations that I think become relevant in the discussion about oversight. The last thing that I just want to mention is that I think that there are a couple of broad factors that apply across the board to areas where there is strong state support. So I thought maybe I could just share some of those with you. One is that there's generally a mechanism by which the local government does report its financial position, whether it's budgets or audits or whatever, to a higher level of government. Another is that they do have some state monitoring process for that. In some cases, there's statutory mechanisms for the state to actually intervene. We also see state history of intervening to help the distressed local governments, whether or not they actually have any kind of statutory mechanism. And then the last thing I just want to mention is we observe that there are many states that have the power to oversee local affairs of the local governments, and some of those have some pretty wide-ranging features, such as the ability to appoint a receiver, a conservator, or a control board that could have a wide breadth of powers and responsibilities. They can control local tax issues. They can manage unions. They can cut expenditures. They can identify opportunities to raise revenue. They could renegotiate collective bargaining agreements, and sometimes they can either go so far as guaranteeing debt. But there is a wide variety. We see all different opportunities, and I just have to agree with the basic premises that Adrienne and her colleagues put in their piece, which is that oversight is a positive, but what you do with that and how you manage it really, in our perspective, does have an impact on the overall credit position. Thank you very much.
Obviously, with the bankruptcy discussions and obviously the governor of Puerto Rico this afternoon, these are all very, very timely topics, so it's exciting to be part of the discussion. And I just have, I'm going to just ask the first question to Adrienne, and I'm going to press my luck here, make sure I'm understanding her paper. Adrienne, was the focus on your paper to figure out that a fire may have occurred as opposed to trying to put the fire out? You know, it seems like the title was detecting fiscal. So you really, you know, it's really not the medicine the patient has to take, but just to figure out that he or she has a fever. Is that the correct?
Yeah.
And my question then becomes has anyone been successful in doing that? at the state level. To say, oh my God, look at Atlantic City 7 years ago, they're going to go down the tubes. Has anyone been able to do that from your research? And maybe that wasn't part of your survey, but that's my question. And that's the only question I'll ask, and we'll throw it open.
And that wasn't a specific focus, but I do think that it's funny that you mentioned Atlantic City, because I think New Jersey and North Carolina are two states that are often pointed to as, doing a pretty good job of doing this. And like Gail said, doing fiscal monitoring well, detecting distress well, doesn't mean that you'll never have a bankruptcy. It doesn't mean that you'll never have, but those things will happen. But, I would think that on balance, they're doing much better than if they would have
nothing, obviously.
hadn't done that.
If I could just respond to your question. My observation has been that in places like, I hate to keep going back to New York, but I think you made a reference to it before, New York City, Erie County, Buffalo, Nassau County, these are places that actually ended up with control boards that are put in place because there was an oversight and an intervention. And in all of those cases, the intervention was successful to be able to bring those municipalities back in the fray, able to, whether they did it through another entity selling debt on their behalf, or managing their budget process, or managing their expenditure reductions, it can help. On the other hand, there are a lot of cities in Pennsylvania that actually go into Act 47 oversight programs that go in and never come out. So I think there's a right? There's a wide variety of effectiveness.
I think one of the very important points that you brought out, Gail, was it's almost like counseling. Because participants in this room have all seen the large-scale bankruptcies, in my opinion, starting with Detroit being the first large-scale. And there's a lot to learn from that. And maybe counseling and just getting around the conference table trying to figure out is going to be far more effective, both for the state who will be overseeing the process, but equally important for the citizens and their basic services.
But sometimes you do need a stick, not just a carrot.
No, I know. A lot of issues, but it's nice to get everyone in the room and try to resolve it before you file. That's a comment I'm making, but not making that representation from the group. Sir?
Your stress here is, or your emphasis is on detecting fiscal stress. Okay, now that we have that established, though, I think, from the public standpoint, that they're just not going into some bureaucrat's hands at the state treasurer's office. These reports sometimes are not delivered in a way, or compiled in a way that's comparable across state lines. They're using state statutory reporting, cash basis accounting. New Jersey's a horrible example of how they won't adopt GASB standards, which I think are very valuable. I think that, I don't know whether your study did that, but it would be interesting to know as to whether you looked at that, as to the level, what they required when they were detecting it, and whether that information was made available to the public.
Again, I think it varies depending on the state, and you'll find 50 different answers to that. But there are some states where transparency and accountability to the public are key features of what they're trying to do. And in those states, we see a lot recently of, states putting things online, which is great. But yeah, it varies.
Chris?
I noticed, Gail, that you assess, or you said you assess, the probability of, I believe it was timely repayment and default and whatnot. And I took specific interest in the word probability. And I'm wondering, is what you do assess probabilities, or is what you do provide a scoring scale that is, to some degree, disassociated or not fully connected with probabilities of repayment, probabilities of default?
So if we replace the word probability with the word likelihood, that might make it easier. There is statistical background that guides the rating scale, which is the assessment levels, right? But at the upper end of the rating scale, frankly, where most of the rated local governments live, right? The median state rating for us is AA1, which is the second highest. The median local government geo rating is AA3. So they're very high levels, and the probability of default over a 1 year and a 5 year horizon are actually very, very small. But in a way, it's ordinal. It's ordinal, yet it's also analytically statistical. But we don't sit around in a committee and talk about what's the exact probability of this AA3 GO defaulting. What we've done over time in the way we do our methodologies is that you look at what are the characteristics of the states that actually have become weaker and kind of have these gradations and evaluate it that way. But it's assessing the likelihood of payment, and for us, it's also assessing the recovery if there is a default.
Question right here.
Yeah, I'd like to get back to or raise the issue of how we measure success in these kinds of programs, because I'm puzzled that anybody would be surprised about Atlantic City in the context of the New Jersey process that you laid out, and that's been given so much praise from people standing outside. But if you sit inside New Jersey, what you see is a pro forma system where, like Pennsylvania, many go in and almost nobody comes out. And how you can consider that success in any way, I think gets us to the question of, is monitoring and what's the end goal here? All right? Is the end goal to know that somebody's headed off the cliff, or is the end goal to get them further away from the cliff? And if you're worried about that, if that's the goal, the second one is the goal, then again, to sound more like an economist than I ought to, then you got to start getting at some of these economic linkages and the economic problems, right? You can't take a basket case like Camden, New Jersey, and just let it go for now 2 generations. You've got to figure out how to restructure it or change it or redefine its boundaries or do something about the services it has to provide given the fact it has no tax base, et cetera. Okay? Shouldn't that be the next part of what it is we should be talking about and doing? That measuring that success.
I'll do a quick answer of my view on that and then let Adrienne really take it. It's my observation that sometimes preventing the patient from dying is just in and of itself may be adequate. It may not bring vitality back to an area that has a significant amount of economic stress, but as long as they haven't died, in a way, it's been somewhat successful. So I would just leave that out. It's not optimal, but at least if you haven't prevented that falling over the cliff, if the state hasn't prevented that, then that is a positive in some respect. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that fiscal monitoring is a start, and it's, you can't measure fiscal. If you have that in place, then you can start to look at other things, but it's hard to imagine if you don't have a system in place to detect the distress in the first place, where would you go from there? So,
if I could just make one other comment that I think to you is totally obvious. Sometimes having the monitoring and having the oversight doesn't stop the problem from happening, right? Detroit had an emergency manager. They had oversight. There were plans in place, but the fundamental economics were so severe that even that strong infrastructure could not stop that restructuring from happening.
Yes, and
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
in the way
Mm-hmm.
not worked.
Yeah.
So all of the
How's it working?
things work.
Well, on that note, I think we've proven once again we want to have another conference next year. So I think we have about 4 different topics that we can further explore. So I want to thank everyone for your patience, your attention. I know we're all very competitive in everyday life, but I think everyone's going to agree that I don't care what breakout sessions, there's no 3 better papers than our papers here. So thank you very much, and everyone did a wonderful job.